Breathe deep. Imagine your legs more limber in Duluth Trading Double Flex Denim. Envision euphorically squatting for that can of suds, bending for your toolbox in a state of bliss, lunging for your laser level on a whole new level. Relax and allow the flex to fill you with ability. Find your inner flex in Double Flex Denim only at Duluth Trading.
On December 16th, 1974, Jim Catfish Hunter received a call that would change the trajectory of his career. Hunter had become a huge Major League Baseball star that year. The pitcher had helped bring the Oakland Athletics to their third consecutive World Series title and had earned himself the Cy Young Award. However, not everything was going smoothly. You see, Hunter was guaranteed monthly insurance payments by his contract with his team, but the owner of the A's, Charles Finley, had repeatedly failed to meet these terms. At the time, players like Hunter were completely bound by their contract with their team, with very little power to negotiate. But despite some discouragement, Hunter decided to fight for his rights. And so began the landmark Catfish Hunter arbitration case. On that day in December, after much discussion and a notable revision, arbitrator Peter Seitz delivered his final written opinion. Hunter listened to the ruling and then hung up the phone and turned to his wife. "We don't belong to anybody," he told her. Catfish Hunter had just become Major League Baseball's first ever free agent. Hey everyone, it's Kavitha Davidson, and welcome to another episode of Sportly. Each week, we discuss lesser-known sports history, iconic events, notable athletes, and impactful moments on and off the field. Moments that all too often fall to the sidelines of history. This week, we'll be taking a deep dive into the historic fight for free agency within professional sports and the players' unions that made this possible. Free agency allows players whose contracts have expired to negotiate and sign with any team. They're free to go wherever they desire as long as there is an offer on the table. This both creates open market competition, allowing players to maximize their financial value, and gives players the autonomy to choose which team they play for. That sounds pretty good, right? But as we'll see, free agency wasn't always an option. And in fact, within many professional sports, it took decades of player pushback, collective action, and unionization to secure this level of athlete freedom. We begin with Major League Baseball, the oldest of America's major professional sports leagues. In 1879, following the National League's fourth season, the league implemented what is known as the Reserve Clause. Found within player contracts, the Reserve Clause bound players to a single team indefinitely. When a player's contract expired, his team had the exclusive right to renew the contract, preventing him from negotiating with any other teams. The team had sole discretion in the player's fate, deciding whether he would be re-signed, traded, sold, or released. In other words, players had pretty much no autonomy or bargaining power. And to make matters more complicated, in the 1922 Supreme Court case Federal Baseball Club v. National League, the court ruled that baseball did not count as interstate commerce. It was just a game and not a business, they said. In practice, this granted MLB an exemption from federal antitrust laws, which allowed the Reserve Clause to be enforced without legal challenge for much of the 20th century. Now, it should be noted that Major League Baseball still enjoys an antitrust exemption not pertaining to the Reserve Clause, despite numerous challenges to the original ruling in front of the Supreme Court. Players did not take the Reserve Clause lying down. In 1885, John Montgomery Ward and 8 other players formed the first ever baseball union, the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players. The group assembled to oppose both the Reserve Clause as well as a growing push among owners to cap players' salaries. This was soon followed by various other attempts to unionize, once in 1900, again in 1912, and once more in 1946. While none of these groups were able to abolish the reserve clause, they did represent important early attempts at unionization. In 1953, a group of players made yet another attempt at collective action, but this time was different. To gain more control over the players' underfunded pension fund, the men formed the Major League Baseball Players Association, the MLBPA. And while the association had an admittedly rocky start, it really began to take shape in 1966 with the introduction of newly elected executive director Marvin Miller. Miller was a highly respected economist and labor leader, and he was ready to take the MLBPA to the next level. In a 2010 interview with the MLB Players Trust, he said,
"What interested me most about a small-sized organization starting from scratch was how it could be shaped. It was such a marvelous opportunity to put into play every idea I had about how a democratic union should operate."
But there was one small problem. Many players were hesitant to accept Miller's leadership. While they saw themselves as an association, Miller's emphasis on unionization made them, nervous. They were influenced by the league's union-busting talking points, and many initially worried that if they unionized, Miller would push them to go on strike, which is something that many of them just couldn't afford to do. As a result, during his first meetings with players from the Angels, Giants, Cubs, and Indians, Miller was given the silent treatment. But the new executive director was determined. He soon reminded the PA members that really, by legal definition, they were already a union. And he promised that the players themselves would set the tone. This was their union. Here's Miller again.
This was a labor-intensive industry. The employees are not just employees, they're not just cogs in a wheel who can be replaced. They are the bedrock on which the whole industry is built.
The players were finally convinced. As former catcher Ted Simmons later told the MLB Players Trust,
"Marvin was a great listener. It was the single most important thing about him. Every single player present, he listened to every single one."
Miller was an incredibly effective leader. In 1968, he helped players negotiate the first ever collective bargaining agreement, or CBA, in professional sports. The CBA raised the minimum salary in baseball from $6,000 to $10,000. And in 1970, Miller helped the MLBPA negotiate the right to arbitration to resolve grievances. Now, this is essentially a structured process for settling disputes between players and management. Grievances are submitted to a neutral third party, an arbitrator, for a binding decision. This way, neither party has to deal with the financial cost or hassle of going to court. Little did Miller know, this process would later prove essential in the fight for free agency.
Whoa! That was a bop! Ooh, let's keep the party going with the claptrap public domain serenade! Happy birthday to you! Let's all loot and shoot! Ba-ba-doo-doo! Borderlands 4! Well, that kind of fell apart toward the end. But you get the idea. Borderlands 4 is out now! Buy it! Buy it, buy it, buy it!
Rated M for mature.
On the morning of October 8th, 1969, St. Louis Cardinals center fielder Curt Flood received an unwelcome call. He was, much to his surprise, being traded to the Philadelphia Phillies. There was a hitch. Flood didn't want to go. He was the longest tenured player on the Cards. He had led the team to 3 World Series, and he was very popular. How could they take him away from his team now? Flood quickly complained to the commissioner of baseball, Bowie Kuhn, requesting that the league make him a free agent. Kuhn denied the request, citing, of course, the league's reserve clause. But Flood still wasn't having it. He filed an antitrust lawsuit against Kuhn, the presidents of the National and American Leagues, and the owners of the 24 baseball clubs. He claimed violations of the federal antitrust laws, civil rights laws, state statutes, and the common law. He even pointed to violations of the 13th Amendment, drawing parallels between the Reserve Clause and involuntary servitude. As he mentioned within various news interviews covered by Retro Report on PBS.
A master and slave relationship.
You're a man who makes $90,000 a year, which isn't exactly slave wages. What's your retort to that?
A well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave.
And driving his point home, Flood invoked the spirit of the civil rights movement.
Me as a black man, I'm probably a lot more sensitive to the rights of other people because I have been denied these rights. What I really want out of this thing is to give every ball player the chance to be a human being and to take advantage of the fact that we live in a free and democratic society.
With the unprecedented backing of Miller and the Players Union, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And yet, his attempts were ultimately unsuccessful. In the court's 1972 Flood v. Kuhn decision, the justices upheld the Reserve Clause. Though the court stated in its decision that the Reserve Clause was an aberration and an anomaly, it ruled that overturning MLB's antitrust exemption was a matter for Congress, not the courts. It was a legal loss for Flood and his fellow players. But his efforts were not in vain. The court's questioning of the Reserve Clause set the stage for future challenges outside the legal system. And in fact, victory was just around the corner. As you heard in our intro, in December 1974, Catfish Hunter had just become Major League Baseball's first free agent. But Hunter's win was singular. It was applicable only to his case, and it was not a league-wide implementation of free agency. That would come soon. In 1975, pitchers Dave McNally and Andy Messersmith took their own shot at challenging the Reserve Clause. But unlike Flood, they didn't seek out a lawsuit. They took it to arbitration. After all, as league lawyers had argued in Flood v. Kuhn, the Reserve Clause was a collective bargaining issue, not a matter to be decided by the courts. So it was time to put arbitration to the test. Eager to challenge the Reserve Clause, Marvin Miller himself represented the players. MLB chief negotiator John Guerin represented the owners. The case was decided by an impartial arbitrator, Peter Seitz. On December 23, 1975, Seitz issued a 64-page ruling siding with the players. The grievances of Messersmith and McNally are sustained, he wrote. There is no contractual bond between these players and the Los Angeles Dodgers and Montreal Expos, respectively. For the first time in MLB history, the Reserve Clause had been successfully challenged, allowing players to engage in contract negotiations and free agency. But it wasn't over yet. The owners panicked. They worried that most players would become free agents on an annual basis, creating absolute chaos within the league. So it was time to negotiate a compromise. Negotiations continued until July of 1976, when both sides collectively agreed that free agency would be granted to players whose contracts had expired, with 6 years of Major League service under their belts. And with that, 97 years after its initial establishment, baseball's Reserve Clause was finally put to rest. Burdened by their own reserve clauses, various other leagues soon began to follow suit, beginning with basketball. In 1967, 21 years after the formation of the National Basketball Association, a new league entered the game, the American Basketball Association. Players could now choose to bring their talents over to a different league, theoretically creating competition. But the ABA seemed unable to convince any NBA players to jump ship and switch leagues. That is, until forward Rick Barry made a move. In 1967, Barry challenged the Reserve Clause by attempting to transfer from the NBA's Golden State Warriors to the ABA's Oakland Oaks. The case went to court, making Barry the first modern athlete to legally challenge the Reserve Clause. The young rebel ultimately lost his case, and he was forced to either play for the Warriors or sit out a year. So Barry chose to sit. But while his playing career may have been put on hold, his attempt to switch leagues had created something much bigger, a bidding war. And in turn, the new competition helped increase player salaries. Seeing this, the NBA soon opened discussions with the ABA over a possible merger. And this would effectively eliminate healthy competition for player services, putting players' bargaining powers back at square one. To many within the National Basketball Players Association, this was unacceptable. Taking a page out of Curt Flood's book, in 1970, the Players Union filed a class action antitrust lawsuit. The suit bore the name of Cincinnati Royals point guard Oscar Robertson, who was the president of the union. Their primary goal was to block the merger between the NBA and the ABA. But as the suit developed, their goals evolved to include challenging the reserve clause, emphasizing the fact that the NBA's restriction of player movement violated antitrust laws. In a recent interview with former NBA players Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson on their podcast All the Smoke, Robertson explained.
Well, we went to court originally to stop the ABA from joining the NBA. That's what it was all about. And then these other things came about players' rights and whether or not if you had a contract and you didn't have no other connection to a team, could you go somewhere else? The NBA said you couldn't. They said they had perpetual rights to you forever, which was not true.
After years of negotiations, the suit was finally settled in 1976. The settlement, which became known as the Oscar Robertson Rule, eliminated the reserve or option clause in the NBA's uniform player contract. While Robertson and his fellow players ultimately did not succeed in blocking the merger, the 6-year delay had allowed for something even greater, a new contract structure. The league agreed to let players become free agents in exchange for a right of first refusal. Now, this meant that the original team could hold on to the player if they matched a competing team's offer. And a player's new team was required to compensate his original team for taking one of their players. So this was the start of restricted free agency, a monumental step in players' freedom of movement in the NBA. But with these restrictions, players weren't completely free. The NBPA was determined to continue the push for complete freedom. In 1988, the union filed another antitrust lawsuit in federal court. The players alleged that the right of first refusal, in addition to the salary cap and restrictive draft practices, violated antitrust laws by restricting player movement. The parties soon shook hands on a new 6-year CBA. And this included the elimination of the right of first refusal, officially establishing unrestricted free agency for veteran players. Within days, Seattle Supersonics power forward Tom Chambers became the first ever truly unrestricted free agent in NBA history, leaving Seattle for the Phoenix Suns. The next season, Chambers led the Suns to the Western Conference Finals. And they did it again the following season.
You're tuned into Auto Intelligence, live from Auto Trader, where data, tools, and your preferences sync to make your car shopping smooth.
They're searching inventory.
Oh, yeah.
They find what you need.
They're gonna find it.
You can make a budget for your wallet to help you succeed. Pricing's precise and true.
So true.
It's smarter car shopping.
Ooh.
Just for you.
Oh, it's just for you. Ooh. Find your next ride at autotrader.com. Powered by Auto Intelligence.
Now, compared to both baseball and basketball, the fight for free agency in football was, well, longer and more complex. When the NFL was founded in 1920, they established a reserve rule of their own, binding players to a single team. But in 1947, the league decided to try something a little different, switching to the one-year option rule. This allowed teams to use a reserve clause one time after the expiration of a player's contract. And after that, the player was free to sign with any team. Through the one-year option rule, the NFL actually became the first professional sports league to introduce some nascent form of free agency. And in 1963, 49ers wide receiver R.C. Owens became the first player to switch teams under this new rule, signing with the Baltimore Colts. But there was a problem. Team owners had been fine with the new rule when none of their players were actually using it to leave. But now, Niners owner Vic Morabito was very unhappy with Owens' departure, and he even went so far as to make several public complaints. In response, in 1963, the owners proposed the Rozelle Rule. This allowed the commissioner the right to award compensation from a team signing a free agent to the team losing them. Compensation could be in the form of players, draft picks, or cash considerations. In 1976, the National Football League Players Association challenged the Rozelle Rule in Mackey v. NFL, and the court found that the rule violated the Sherman Antitrust Act as an unreasonable restraint on trade. It effectively deterred clubs from negotiating with and signing free agents, decreasing players' bargaining power in contract negotiations and denying them the right to sell services in an open market and hindering their movement in interstate commerce. Now, that should have been the end of it. But instead of just eliminating the Rozelle Rule once and for all, it was replaced with something pretty similar. As part of a 1977 collective bargaining agreement with the NFL, the players' union settled for a right of first refusal restriction on free agency. The original team was also entitled to draft pick compensation from the signing team. Now, believe it or not, things only get more complicated from there. In 1989, owners unilaterally imposed what is known as Plan B free agency, giving teams the right to protect 37 of their players from becoming free agents. Unprotected players were free to negotiate and sign with any team. But the team's best 37 players were not given these freedoms, which defeated the purpose. In the spring of 1990, the Players Association filed an antitrust lawsuit against the NFL on behalf of 8 players harmed by the Plan B system. And in September 1992, in McNeil v. NFL, the system was officially struck down by the jury. The following year, yet another case, White v. NFL, was instrumental in officially establishing what we now know as modern-day free agency in football. Now, as you may have already noticed, within each sport's path to free agency, player unions have played a critical role. From collective bargaining agreements to arbitration cases to lawsuits, these unions have been and continue to be instrumental in advancing the rights of athletes and ensuring that they don't fall victim to the teams and leagues in which they play. So, how did these player associations get their start? Now, we've already heard about the beginnings of the Major League Baseball Players Association. But now let's turn to basketball. For decades, NBA players were, quite frankly, mistreated. From $8,000 salaries to no pension plans, per diems, no minimum wages, no health benefits, they certainly didn't receive the wide-ranging privileges and protections that players have today. But in 1954, point guard Bob Cousy of the Boston Celtics set out to change that. His goal was to organize players into a formal union. He began by writing to an established player from each team in the league, seeking their input and support. The approach was a big success, and the National Basketball Players Association, the NBPA, was soon formed, with Cousy as its first president. At first, the NBA refused to recognize the union, but Cousy and his association were determined to make themselves seen. In 1957, after serious threats of a player strike, the NBA agreed to enter into discussion with the union. And the NBA Board of Governors finally recognized the NBPA, agreeing to a list of requests. To this day, the formation of the union continues to be one of Bob Cousy's biggest professional accomplishments. As he told NBC Sports in 2023,
one of the things I'm most proud about is starting the Players Association, because that somehow has lent itself 60 years later in terms of the interaction between the players and the owners Players Association to guys signing $300 million contracts for 5 years of playing a child's game.
For years, the pension program remained a massive point of contention within the union. And it wasn't until 1964 that the PA gained its first major victory with this hot-button issue. That year, players threatened to not play in the first ever nationally televised All-Star game unless a pension plan were established. The NBPA was formally recognized as the exclusive bargaining agent of players, and the per diem increased to $8 per day. Now, at first, the NBA was having none of it. Maybe they thought that the union was bluffing. But on game day, with camera crews set up and ready to televise, no players were willing to step out into the court, and the league finally caved. Mere minutes before the game, NBA President Walter Kennedy personally guaranteed that a pension plan would be adopted at the next meeting in May, and the union's other demands would also be met. And so the game went ahead, 10 minutes late, but with 2 full teams, satisfied and ready to play. The NBPA had begun to demonstrate just how powerful it really was. Now, the National Football League Players Association followed a similar trajectory as the NBPA did. In 1956, a group of unhappy Cleveland Browns approached Creighton Miller about setting up a trade association to address player grievances. The attorney and former Notre Dame football star reluctantly accepted the role of legal counsel and chief spokesman. That November, the union held its first player rep meeting at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. Players from 11 of the 12 teams signed on to be represented by the PA, with the Chicago Bears roster as the only holdout. In January of 1957, the union and its players submitted various proposals to NFL Commissioner Burt Bell, and they received no response. But a change was soon to come. In February, the Supreme Court ruled in Radovich v. National Football League that the NFL is a business that cannot abuse its monopoly powers. It must follow antitrust laws. Because of the ruling, the league's owners were forced to recognize the NFLPA and grant as many of its demands, or else face a lawsuit. This was soon followed by the introduction of numerous player benefits, such as pensions, hospitalization coverage, and medical and life insurance. The NFLPA also had begun to feel its power. Today, players' unions remain integral to the protection and advancements of athlete rights and autonomy. The MLBPA, for example, is currently fighting back against the introduction of a salary cap, with the current CBA set to expire in December 2026. Executive Director Tony Clark went so far as to call the proposed cap institutional collusion. If the league doesn't back off, the union could initiate a lockout, delaying the 2027 season. Some players' unions have gone so far as to engage in social justice advocacy. In 2020, for instance, the NBPA partnered with the NBA to form the NBA Foundation. With $300 million in funding, the foundation was created to foster economic empowerment in Black communities with an emphasis on education and employment. It's clear that today, unions have become far more than a protective shield, guarding the individual against these monolithic sports leagues. They're now organizations with power and agency, and above all, the ability to advocate. But that being said, the actual power wielded by these unions doesn't always hold steady, and many feel that player associations often fail to put up a proper fight against their leagues. In many ways, the struggles of player unions are an allegory for unions writ large in America. And despite their challenges, one thing is clear. A strong union is absolutely integral to the health of a successful sports league. Thanks so much for tuning into Sportly. Tune in next week and every week after as we dive into another great story. And if you have thoughts or suggestions for a topic you'd like me to cover, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to email me at kavitha@immigrantlypod.com. Sportly is an Immigrantly media production. This episode was produced by Paroma Chakravarti. Our executive producer is Sadia Khan. written by Emmanuel Monahan. Fact-checked by Joseph Ruelas. Our sound designer and editor is Paroma Chakravarti. Our theme music was created by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Tune back in next week and every week after for more Sportly.